Okay, right. So we've left it for a few more seconds, and hopefully some more people will be joining us as we go along. So this morning we are talking to Sachin Gokhale, and we're delighted to say that we're going to be running a series of webinars, and we'd like to hear from you as well later on. I'll be sending out a survey just to find out what other countries you'd like us to discuss. But for today, when we met with Sachin, we're sort of like, what's a great subject to talk about? And it's, let's talk about Asia payroll. So then versus now. So where are we now? So I'd just like to pass over to Sachin, and Sachin can explain who he is and all about what he's going to be talking about today.
Thanks, Mel, and hello, everybody. And again, Mel, thanks for the opportunity. So my name is Sachin Gokhale. My journey in payroll has been through being a partner of a company in Asia Pacific, where I was doing Vietnam payroll for a company called PayAsia, headquartered out of Singapore. And from that partnership, it turned into me joining, and then it's turned into me being part of that group on a broader scale. So I've learned my payroll knowledge not from being out and out processor of payroll, but having the exposure to a wide variety of countries across the Asia region to learn about what the growth has been in not just payroll, but how companies are thinking about payroll and how governments are reacting around that whole HR and employee well-being. So that was, I thought, going to be quite a high level introduction to the first of our multiple webinar series around Asia payroll. And I look forward to all the questions and challenges that are thrown at me during our webinars over time. So just to kick it off, Asia Pacific, like we had years ago with the Western world, the payroll has evolved. And what was it back then? People always ask, well, what were the changes made? And our clients ask it. A lot of the vendors that are scattered around Asia Pacific try and always say, well, how do we catch up to the world, and how do we catch up to service clients better? But really, when you break it down of what payroll and the thinking around HR and payroll was back then, it was HR and payroll on the strategic table of companies? Were companies talking about the strategy of HR and the employee retentions and the employee engagements and well-being 15, 20 years ago? And honestly, less than 10% were. There was a survey conducted by EY, and it showed that less than 10% of companies in the 2000s were looking at payroll and HR as a strategy. And just to give you a flavor of where we are today, that's over 65%. So that huge shift change in thinking has driven most of the content of why I'm here today and what we have learned as a group being in Asia Pacific and doing this for over 16 years. So just looking at some of the details of what it was back then. Back in the early 2000s, even before then, we had a lack of digitization, not just by companies, but also by governments. And I'll give you some examples. So companies did not invest anywhere near as much money on payroll and HR as they did on their finance platforms, or as they did on their, sales CRM. And what that's done is it's left the payroll teams back then, and they're struggling still to come through it. And I'm talking about Asia Pacific here, in how they can digitize their workflows to make their life more efficient, but more importantly, remain compliant in this changing world of regulation. That's just the company side. I mean, we as a business went on the cloud in 2014, 2015. And we reaped the rewards of doing that back then, because everyone has experienced a hell of a shift change last 12 months. And if we weren't on the cloud, and if we couldn't manage our workforces remotely, and we couldn't have our service delivery, and we couldn't have client satisfaction all settled within that infrastructure that we could build, we wouldn't be where we are today. So corporates were a bit slower in Asia Pacific because they just weren't thinking about it. The second aspect is governments. So we're also perhaps a little bit more spoilt in Australia or the UK, Europe, America, where we have the advantage of lodgements being allowed to be done, digitally. We have good banking infrastructures. Whereas when you looked at years ago in Asia Pacific, the lack of investment was not just at the corporate level, but at the government level too. Many Asia Pacific countries, a few aside, like maybe Singapore, still had paper lodgements. You had to fill out your superannuation pension fund forms and submit them either by scan copy or hand submit them. And I remember stories from 2000, 2001 to 3 in Vietnam when I was doing payroll there. It was manual submissions. And yes, it was acceptable practice then. But when you think about payroll executives and payroll operators in the world trying to make compliance met every month, trying to make their life more efficient, that payroll calendar days used to expand because they had to get the paper form in time to submit it to the authorities. So that digitization was not recognized by the corporates and by governments because the funds they had were deployed somewhere else, as I mentioned, in finance and CRM. Banking infrastructure across Asia Pacific. Well, it's come a long way, but back then you had only the one form of making payments, and there wasn't even an instant form of making a payment. So you either don't have any bank files that you're uploading, you're doing manual uploads, or you're literally taking a bank transfer form into the bank, filling it out and putting it over the counter for the bank clerk to process the salaries. And that banking infrastructure was also a hindrance in the efficiencies that payroll executives needed. And banking infrastructure obviously relies on the governments to pass the laws down to give the banks enough leeway to improve. So that also in the 2000s was quite a manual process which hindered development. Then you look at education, and payroll was not a preferred career path for the youth. I don't remember many people I interviewed who were joining us as payroll executives who actually went to university to study payroll. They either did some finance degree, did engineering, technology. And when you look at Asia and you look at the education level in Asia, where very smart young people, but lack of universities, what you've got is people doing various sorts of degrees, trying to get into any job they can because they just want to earn that money. So that was also a growth path that was needing attention back then. So all in all, it just wasn't a strategy item for corporates and governments. So let's look at where we are now. We've seen a big shift change in digitization. And we did an article in Australia in September last year when it was, the depths of COVID coming out. And the interest level in that article was, well, are companies now adopting more payroll strategies because of digitization? Are they struggling to manage their workforces who are working from home? What is the theme? And the theme is correct. Digitization adoption has gone quite exponentially that way in Asia Pacific, and companies have decided that they have no choice but to invest in infrastructure. They've got to get on the cloud, or they have to have a partnership with a vendor who is on the cloud. They just don't have the right security when you've got people working from home. They're accessing the servers remotely using their home Wi-Fi network, which generally in emerging Asia is not secure, and you're accessing payroll data. So those themes allow the corporates no room but to spend on digitization. And then we've had governments have also done great things over the last few years in bringing, automation to what we call the last mile of payroll. You can calculate a great compliant payroll, but if you don't get your lodgements in on time, you've still got the black mark against you. So countries like Singapore produced their SingPass, their Core Pass, and it's all automated. Australia produced its single touch payroll where post the payroll, You click that button and the tax information gets sent to tax office. And then you've got all the individual employees updated in the back end too. And then, Malaysia's come a long way. Indonesia's come a long way from paper. You've got great adoption of digitization in India, where government websites were finally able to capture lodgement details for social insurance, income tax, etc., rather than people filling out manual forms. So government's got in this play as well. The other theme that's come about a bit slower in Asia Pacific because it is being caught up, but more and more in the Western world, is all around employee well-being and the disruption of socioeconomic behavior. So yes, I've got staff now in Asia Pacific who are trained, who can do the work for me. But then I've got competition rising, and that competition created a lot of churn, and that created a lot of lack of retention. So with that, a lot of companies who were vendors producing and providing payroll solutions to organizations found that retention was creating extra cost. And that extra cost was now causing their whole ROI of being a preferred vendor for companies, out the window. So all that behavior created more and more focus from corporate and governments in how to look after employees better. One example we always use, and it was a classic, was in Philippines. Most countries in Asia will work on a monthly payroll for corporates. Philippines mandated in most circumstances that it has to be fortnightly. Now, when you look at why they did that, and you read a lot of articles around it, and you see the behavior of people on the ground in Philippines, it really came down to the fact that people got paid twice a month. The regular income in Philippines and what they do with that income required a regular flow. Secondly, and probably more importantly for the government there, they were able to collect the tax and the pension fund on a fortnightly basis rather than a monthly basis. And that brought that whole cash flow within the ecosystem further up for the government. So those adoptions of policies where the government really forced it down on companies and said, look, you've got money in the bank already. You're no longer going to pay staff every month. You're going to pay them fortnightly. We've seen a big evolution in payment infrastructure. We're also used to getting on our phones and our banking apps and making foreign transfers, in the click of maybe 3 buttons. But when it comes to payroll, it's sensitive data. You don't want to be doing individual uploads on a bank so that your whole organization who has access and a finance company to look at all the bank statements, you don't want to see what everybody's getting paid. So bank files, but the evolution of payment infrastructure then allowed companies to invest more, where automated bank files were uploaded onto banking infrastructure for payroll payments, where the compliance of companies and vendors who were able to demonstrate that they had the risks covered and the mitigation around compliance well understood, perhaps with ISO and other certifications, were able to say to clients, listen, I've got bank accounts. Why don't you hand me the monies and I'll keep it in my trust account, and then I will pay your staff from my account. So what that does is alleviate that whole security concept and takes away the burden of payment on time and your finance teams stressing out, 1 hour before upload that they have to make that payment. So those evolutions in payment infrastructure and the fact that companies were able to take on monies really has seen a big growth path. I know we in our business collect a lot of money for clients in trust accounts, and we are audited heavily about it every month. So the compliance that governments are doing and the audit firms are doing is helping organizations feel more secure and safe in outsourcing. The rise of Fintech. Pretty sure Western countries are a lot more mature than Asia Pacific when you look at digital wallets, on-demand pay, and in some cases, this buy now, pay later philosophy. And they've been concepts that have been around in US, Europe, Australia for multiple years. And if you were to walk on the streets in Asia Pacific when we're allowed to, or if you read some articles in the paper, you'll find the adoption of fintech really has taken a big leap. In some countries, people have even bypassed traditional banking and gone straight to wallets, because in some Asian countries 15, 20 years ago, it was cash. When I first got into Vietnam in 2001, 90% of business was conducted in cash, and that included payroll. And there was a great story I was told back then that the army had 4 million people, and multiple trucks of cash would be distributed every month around the country to pay those army force people in cash. So it's really evolved since then. The government in Vietnam mandated that you had to pay payroll through a bank account. And then when that started, some banks went really early in the adoption of wallets and mobile and all these other fintech products to attract the large quantity of population onto their platform. Just because, a bigger population will have a bigger mass of banks competing for the same product. So that rise of fintechs come, and we'll touch on something else in the next couple of slides. So what that's proven is that payroll really has now a seat on the strategic table. Payroll is becoming a career path amongst the youth. So that shift change has not just happened in vendors who do payroll outsourcing for companies, but in organizations' readiness when they are looking for payroll vendors. That shift change has really helped how business is being conducted these days in our industry. And just to touch a bit on what now in terms of where we are. So the evolution of fintech, a very hot topic. Employee and financial wellbeing products and services, what are they? Well, they're products and services that most companies are trying to adopt in making their employees stay with them for longer. You've got your OnDemand Pay. You've got your employee wellbeing apps to give you more balance in your work than just work. So the general research on the ground, the general themes that we see in all our clients when we talk to them and all our staff is Asia Pacific is really trying to level the playing field to align employer and employee experience. Can you imagine 10 years ago, if you work for one of the big four companies in US, you have all the best technology. You do your leave application on your mobile. You take a client to a restaurant, you click a photo, and off it goes into your workflow to get approved for expense claim. Well, imagine 10 years ago, that's a same company, but in Asia Pacific, and an employee in that company having to fill out paper expense claims and paper leave forms. So that shift change has happened, and we've seen it in our client base. And I'm sure some of you, or if not all of you, have seen that in your organizations. So Asia Pacific is catching up. And that's because the well-being thing is not just Western country solution. That Asia Pacific piece, we as vendors, we need to know that we have the best of breed products ready to service our customers, because that is the competition that's being driven today. So what have we learned in the last 12 months after me talking about what that looks like today? Well, remote working is here to stay. Whether we like it or not, employees will be given in most organizations the flexibility at the moment to work from home, and maybe there's rosters and shifts, but that is here to stay for the at least the foreseeable future. Data security rules are continuously being strengthened. We've all experienced GDPR. Now, GDPR is probably not that well understood by some people because, it is more strict than one thinks by just reading a summary of what that law covers. And companies struggle with that, especially when you've got vendors trying to get global clients, or you've got organizations who've moved their back office shared service centers into Asia, and these people are looking at data out of Europe. The strengthening of those rules combined with remote working is causing that whole perhaps questioning, can we really have our guys work from home? Is their home infrastructure strong enough that there won't be a cyber attack on payroll data? So these things we've learned in the past, and there's many stories to share. Along with that, you've got obviously all the themes you look at with non-compliance around the world on payroll. During the last 12 months being based in Australia, I know the number of underpayment cases that are reported in the paper regularly. And that's a result of the number of compliance in regulation changing, with perhaps the government giving more support during the last 12 months. And those elements have to be put into the payroll platform. The payroll operators have to be well versed with it. So all those things lead to, can I maintain my compliance given the data security rules and the remote working? And then you look at the first two and you think, well, geez, if my guys are working from home, the employee well-being being a global theme, how do I know that my employee is happy? I don't see them regularly, might have a couple of Zoom calls, but everybody's getting a little bit of, it's a bit too much on these video calls, and people are probably going, no thanks, I'm not going to attend. And one, I believe it was one of the providers globally that released a report last week saying Fridays are Zoom free days, and it's a global bank. So when you think about them saying Fridays are Zoom free days, and you think about what a bank does, you want to service a customer 24/7 if anything goes wrong. And if you can't resolve those theories, and if you can't get leadership teams, and if, we don't have people in offices anymore taking care of serious problems. So that's a very interesting play on what we've learned, and the adoption of well-being with trying to get more retention on people is going to be a growing theme. And Asia Pacific is coming from a position behind Europe and US. So it's got to catch up. And my experience in Asia Pacific has always been, when they've tried to catch up, they kind of missed the second and third step. They just try and leap ahead. I mean, Myanmar's a classic case that most people in Myanmar didn't even bother with landlines. They went straight to mobile. And then the last piece is around how we capture support. And to the point earlier, themes like artificial intelligence, they're digitizing support channels, chatbots. We're now seeing people more and more on corporate WhatsApp groups, and employees just don't have the face-to-face access to HR like they used to. So now you're talking to a computer and you're asking what my leave balance is, or what you're asking, hey, what's the new rule that's come in? Or do I want to make a complaint? I want to do this. So it's all a little bit of a, let's see how we go, but it's a learning from the last 12 months, because we've had to be forced to think about these things, given that we are remote working.
Thanks, Ashin. So we're talking about, what to look for in the future, and I've got some questions actually from your previous slide, so really interesting. So looking into the future, what do you mean by aligned practices and technologies?
Mel, I touched on this slightly earlier, and I'll elaborate a bit more. So it's companies who have employees around the world, and they have employees in emerging economies, and when you've got to give the same experience that someone has in New York, that someone has in London, that someone has in Zurich, that someone has in Prague, that someone has in Bangalore, Sydney, Melbourne, Hanoi, that alignment of practice is probably the biggest challenge companies face today. Because when we talk about employee well-being, you've got to look at, why does not every employee of my business have the same technology to use in their workday? Why is somebody doing paper and why is somebody doing amazing mobile apps? So that alignment of practice and technology has already seen a boost. We've seen it in our customer base, that companies are now spending more money, especially when they link and outsource their solutions. They are kind of forced to do that harmonization. So that's what I meant by aligning practice and technologies, Mel.
Thanks, Ashin. I was actually talking to a global payroll manager yesterday, and we were talking about like the global experience and talent management, and what a fantastic time this is now to be able to recruit talent from all around the world. So what's your perspective on this?
Yeah, it kind of varies, and the talent management piece here is, it is exactly what you say. We've had a really interesting 12 months where people have been let go of jobs. They've been on government support. Companies which have had some government support have been able to retain some people until that government support runs out. So there's a lot of talent around. So now it's about how to create that experience in your organization to attract the best talent. So who will win that race, or how many will win that race? And it's not about just having, I guess, the best t-shirt with a logo anymore. It's not about just having, hey, listen, Fridays we have Tim Tams and we crack open a beer at 4 o'clock because, hey, guess what? We're all working remotely. So that whole talent management experience for us evolves, and the way we think evolves around how you are giving the employee an experience in your workday when they don't have the historical advantage of being face to face with their HR, with their boss, with their peers. So that to us is what's going to create that new age talent management.
Thanks, Ashin. So I just got a question come in.
Sure.
Do you see more and more companies outsourcing their payroll, and why, sort of, versus in-house?
I'll give two parts to that answer. Pre-COVID, and I wasn't going to say that word, but I ended up saying it, so my apologies. Pre-January 2020, the survey that EY conducted in Asia showed that 45% of companies were actually in-housing payroll because of making it part of strategic delivery. And that compares to 28% in early 2010s. So that is an interesting stat. But post January 2020, what we have experienced is, because of the difficulty in maintaining compliance, especially in multi-country jurisdictions, and there was a stat I think we put in the invite, Mel, there's been 400% uplift in compliance changes in payroll in the region. And if you think a person in your organization sitting in their home, managing their families, can keep up with that. So that, along with companies investing in digitization, has certainly, in our view, taken that other trend I mentioned earlier of 28 to 45% down a bit, because we've seen an uplift in inquiries. So yes, we do see more companies looking to outsource, but looking to get a whole experience. So, hey, can you also manage my onboarding? Can you also manage my recruitment? Can you also manage my talent management? So that whole experience is now being sought after.
And before we go on to the financial wellbeing, one of the things that we've noticed is that senior management are coming to us to talk about issues that payroll staff are actually having with vendor management. So, so have you seen any change on that at all, that companies are talking about poor relationships maybe with some of their vendors and looking to either change vendors or looking to see how they can get their staff to manage that relationship? Because obviously the last 12 months must have proved how important it is to have a good relationship with your vendor.
Yeah, absolutely, Mel. And to a point I made earlier about being ready with the infrastructure. So quite a lot of vendors, which are single country or maybe two country vendors, they have a great client base, but they did not invest early enough in the infrastructure to be able to handle remote customer support. So that is definitely a struggle with the smaller organizations. And there has been a shift in terms of, well, maybe not changing vendor as much, but the strategy in choosing a vendor has a greater number of pages in the RFP when it comes to how the vendor has their own cloud infrastructure set up. How is your data security set up? What is your support infrastructure in working remotely? Do you have artificial intelligence and chatbots? Do you have this? So that's definitely been a change. But we don't have enough insights into where people are moving regularly. It's a very sticky business, so I'd be surprised if there's been a massive change in vendors.
Okay, so going on to employee and financial well-being. So this is, I feel, like a huge subject, and it's a subject that some payroll people love and they don't hate. I think it's a true Marmite subject. So
Yeah.
what's the thoughts in Asia? I've spoken to a lot of people in the US who are into sort of like the financial well-being. UK a little bit reserved. So what's Asia's thoughts?
Um, Look, Asia's thoughts is more driven by financial well-being than actual psychological well-being. Just because that's the way it's always been in Asia, people just want their money. When you compare um, the economies in some of the emerging countries, will the guy want to know how to do some exercises better, or would he want to be paid every day? So the themes are more towards things like early wage access and on-demand pay. And there has been an emergence we've seen in India, we've seen a little bit in Indonesia, we've certainly seen in Malaysia, Australia, where companies are bringing their early wage access and partnering with organizations and partnering with payroll companies to say, hey, we can offer this as an upsell to your clients. So that's been the biggest driver. And the second piece is when you want to link a financial benefit to a employee's pay packet. So you might say, hey, you've had your monies. I've got a marketplace partner, and here are all the things you can acquire from that marketplace partner, and they come at a discount. Oh, and guess what? In some cases, we can actually pay that through your payroll, like insurance, like your in Australia, a company went on the ASX last Friday, which is a online pet homestay service provider, a SaaS business. Amazing. But, imagine it's those kind of companies, marketplaces linking to payroll providers, because payroll providers have the greatest insight into organizations and their pay and their behavior and their demographics. That's been the bigger emergence versus what maybe is a little bit more in America and Europe around, yes, financial, but also the psychological.
Is there some countries, so one of the key issues that when we've discussed the financial well-being in the US, it seems to have been sorted out a little bit more on the legislation side, but in Asia, are there like some countries that are maybe a bit stickier on legislation with on-demand pay?
Australia, definitely. Australia has already one of the most complex award systems in HR, in payroll in the world. So they're, it's convincing certain economies and certain governments that on-demand pay is not akin to a payday loan. It is not akin to a salary advance. And that's what's been the traditional way of some people in Asia Pacific getting money early. It's payday lending. I take my payslip to a money lender, I give them that, they verify it, and I get a portion of my pay in cash. And how I pay it is through exorbitant interest rates. And then all these money lenders have to be licensed with the government to be able to perform their work. So payroll's got to be very careful that it doesn't fall into that. And it's got to be what we describe it as a module in a human capital management suite of services that you offer a customer. And how you create that funding around it. With larger customers, obviously some customers are happy at that scale to leverage their own balance sheet. But when you've got the small and medium customers who don't have the ready cash all the time to service the employees, you've got to create a very clever financial model solution around that. So it's a subscription-based service. You don't want to fall into a lending sphere, which, to your point, Mel, will require licensing.
So if anybody does have any questions, feel free to ask us, put them in the chat or Q&A. One thing that I have, which you mentioned earlier in a previous slide about Australia having problems with underpayments, and there's been so much in the press, isn't there? All different organisations that have been caught called out by this. Obviously, with minimum wage being introduced into a lot of countries now, and with it seems to be like a retail, seems to be more of an issue in retail. Correct me if I'm wrong. Do you see that? Do you see that this is a global issue? Because I feel like this is going to start happening potentially in the UK with holiday pay. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And we've already seen some countries in Asia try to adopt minimum wage. And these are countries which had ridiculously low unofficial minimum wage. I had a really great conversation with one of our investors today, because what they asked was, hey, this on-demand pay, when you've got companies who are paying weekly and fortnightly and not monthly, right? Their administration is a burden because they're calculating payroll regularly. Would they prefer the solution more where all they're doing is calculating payroll once and saving that burden, but then having the on-demand pay solution so they're not disenfranchising their employees? So that was a really great question and commentary that we spent about 20 minutes just chatting about. And I think that minimum wage, look, many countries may not adopt minimum wage. It kind of goes against their grain, but we see it as a big theme. We've already seen some countries in Asia adopt it, but Australia is heavily regulated on that, with a different award in every different job you could think of. So yeah, we see it as a theme, but we think the wellbeing products that are being put into the ecosystems of payroll vendors will actually alleviate some of those problems in the short term.
So I know we didn't want to mention COVID, sorry, but you did.
All right.
I don't think there's a way of getting past it, really, is it? We could talk about the challenges of the last 12 months, but I think we all know what the challenges have been and why. So one of the key things I wondered from the perspective of Asia, and we've seen it in Europe and in the States, has the profile of the payroll industry increased within organisations, or just in general?
Awareness certainly has. And payroll associations in some of the jurisdictions that we work in are making the extra effort. Organizations are making the extra effort to become a member, because they are then updated on compliance changes. And everything for us that we see, and we are deep in compliance in our service, we've been deep in compliance and we remain deep in compliance. That's been the core driver of why people are looking at more sources of the truth, more data points to keep, when they're in-housing their payroll, keep themselves abreast of changes.
So we've had a fantastic question from Sam, so thanks for this. With the growing awareness of the complexity and need to bring Asia payroll more in line globally, is this bringing recognition of increasing payroll staff salaries? Also, is the shared services market in Asia, specifically Manila, becoming more competitive for talented staff? So I think I know, actually, in Manila, I know there is more competition for staff. But anyway, yeah. I'll pass it over to you.
Oh, it's a great question, Sam. And we always debate internally. Payroll changes in legislation every year, minimum once, right? Maybe in some countries a lot more. Accounting. And I'm an accountant, so I can say this without anyone else getting offended. Accountants have had debit and credit their entire lives, right? Accounting legislation globally really comes in maybe once every few years. So when you talk about aligning a payroll expert to an accountant or maybe a bookkeeper, I would say the salaries certainly have increased in the jurisdictions that we operate in, because you really need to make sure you are incentivizing and you're getting the right talent who is going to stay on top of their game, especially in the playing field we're in, which is multi-country payroll. 41 countries, you want to keep on top of compliance, you better have the right people and you better pay them right to do that. So we've seen it go up, Sam. It's a great question. It's a debate that my MD and I have on a regular basis, and there's no winner.
I think we do obviously with the Swedish Payroll Association. That's what they found over the last 5 years, that competition has increased, where the profiles increased, and also obviously the salaries. We found that also in Ireland, in Dublin. There's a lot of movement there, and the salaries have really increased, and also in Mauritius. So Mauritius organisations have had to find out other ways, not only just salary, to incentivize people to stay with them, but other things as well. So maybe a good thing for the payroll industry, maybe not so much for companies, because it gives them a bit more stress to keep their staff.
No, but to us, when we look at that, Mel, it's, you know, what is the risk you're willing to take with a non-compliance event versus looking after your payroll staff? And in majority of cases, I've seen many P&Ls and balance sheet in my life. Most of the times, staff salaries are a fair percentage of total expense.
Yeah.
So,
in perspective. Okay. Well, I think that's brought it to an end. So thank you so much, Sachin. As I said, we will be speaking to Sachin on a monthly basis. So I will be sending a survey out to everyone just to discuss, to find out what other areas you'd like us to talk about. As Pay Group deals with over 40 different countries. So you've got your fingers in a lot of countries. Maybe that's not the right saying.
I wish I could visit them, Mel. Can't wait.
I know, Sachin. I think we're all ready, aren't we, to at least start moving, getting on a train, or just getting on a plane and seeing people and having a bit of human contact.
Absolutely.
So thank you so much, Sachin. Thank you so much for sharing your experience. If anybody does have any questions after this webinar, you know, please feel free to contact me. You've all got my email address, and I can pass them on to Sachin, and we'll share them. So thanks again, Sachin, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you very much. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.